tapping with everybody. You know how it go. We're gonna tag the world up. But this morning we're gonna talk about going through the book, The Destruction of the Black Civilization. Because a lot of people kept asking me. I know I referenced it in many times, so I said, well, let's go through it. And early on, if it's just the beginning entry of the book, I probably skip through it if it don't seem important. But I'm going to show you, I definitely tap in. So this book was written by William Chancellor in like the early 1900s. But he had education, then he went to school in London and Europe, and that's how he learned about a lot of the things that we're going to speak about today. You know what I mean? But I'm going to let him build.
The Destruction of Black Civilization. Great Issues of a Race from 4500 BC to 2000 AD by Chancellor Williams. Copyright 1974. Dedication to the black youth of the 1960s for beginning the second great emancipation, the liberation of our minds, and thus changing the course of history.
Hold on, let's skip. I think this is the very beginning.
9 months a year, while we go to a ramshackle old barn-like building only 5.5 months, and then to the cotton fields. Why? In the 6th grade, one of our teachers, Miss Alice Crossland, helped me to become a sales agent for the Crisis and the Norfolk Journal and Guide. This was like turning on the floodlights of heaven. For the books on our race, listed on the back pages of the Crisis, started me off on this never-ending search, but raised more questions as I progressed through school. Raised more perplexing questions than were answered. For having read everything about the African race that I could get my hands on, I knew even before leaving high school that, 1, the land of the blacks was not only the cradle of civilization itself, but that the blacks were once the leading people on earth. 2, that Egypt...
Right now he's telling you reasons why he wrote the book. And like he said, he realized that through studying and through school, that we had even ruled and we were in control.
Was not only once all black, but the very name Egypt was derived from the blacks. 3, and that the blacks were the pioneers in the sciences, medicine, architecture, writing, and were the first builders in stone, etc. The big unanswered question then was, what had happened? How was this highly advanced black civilization so completely destroyed that its people in our times and for some centuries past have found themselves not only behind the other peoples of the world, but even the color of their skin a sign of inferiority, bad luck, and the badge of the slave, whether bond or freed? And since I had learned that whites were once enslaved as generally as any other race, how did it come about that slavery was finally concentrated in Africa for blacks only? In short, no books or other studies in high school and college answered or gave clues to answers to the problems that puzzled me most. For no matter what the factual data were, all the books written about the blacks by their conquerors reflected the conquerors' viewpoints. Nothing else should have been expected, and considering how thoroughgoing was the capture of the minds of the blacks also, it is really not surprising that so many Negro scholars still faithfully follow in the footsteps of their white masters. I was convinced that what troubled me and what I wanted to know was what troubled the black masses and what they wanted to know. We wanted to know the whole truth, good and bad, for it would be a continuing degradation of the African people if we simply destroyed the present system of racial lies embedded in world literature, only to replace it with glorified fiction based more on wishful thinking than the labors of historical research. My inquiry, therefore, was concerned with black civilization alone. what the blacks themselves achieved independently of either Europe or Asia. This was an entirely new approach to the study of the history of the blacks. It meant, first of all, segregating traditional African institutions from those later influenced by Islamic Asia and Christian Europe. In this way, and in no other, we can determine what our heritage really is, and instead of just talking about identity, we shall know at least precisely what purely African body of principles, value systems, or philosophy of life, slowly evolved by our own forefathers over countless ages, from which we can develop an
I think it's important of what William Chancellor is pointing out. I always thought this was a great book, and I didn't get all the way through it. I got through a good section, but I always go back because it'd be so much information. But what he just said, which I'm gonna go back, is something that we all should think and feel about, like not just trying to figure out who we are, but what our identity is.
Either Europe or Asia. This was an entirely new approach to the study of the history of the blacks. It meant, first of all, segregating traditional African institutions from those later influenced by Islamic Asia and Christian Europe. In this way, and in no other, we can determine what our heritage really is, and instead of just talking about identity, we shall know at least precisely what purely African body of principles, value systems, or philosophy of life, slowly evolved by our own forefathers over countless ages, from which we can develop an African ideology to guide us onward. In other words, there can be no real identity with our heritage until we know what our heritage really is. It is all hidden in our history, but we are ignorant of that history. So we have been floating along, basking blissfully in the sunny forefathers over countless ages, from which we can develop an African ideology to guide us onward. In other words, there can be no real identity with our heritage until we know what our heritage really is.
There can be, the point that he's making right now is that we, in America right now, especially, and this was the 60s, that a lot of us are broken up into religious groups, different sects, what we think, but there can be no real clarity until we know who we are, is what he's saying. This is one of the most important books in our times that we don't hear about. Let's go back a little bit.
Precisely what purely African body of principles, value systems, or philosophy of life, slowly evolved by our own forefathers over countless ages, from which we can develop an African ideology to guide us onward. In other words, there can be no real identity with our heritage until we know what our heritage really is. It is all hidden in our history, but we are ignorant of that history. So we have been floating along, basking blissfully in the sunny heritage of other peoples. My research was a quest for some specific answers to very specific questions. Some of these were: 1. How did all black Egypt become all white Egypt? Note, at this point, that mulattoes were classified as white in Egypt. All North Africa and the Middle East, a fact that still confuses blacks in the United States, where the very opposite policy was adopted. 2.
He said that mulattoes in Egypt, that's like mixed kids and shit, were considered, they weren't considered African.
What were some of the specific details in the process of so completely blotting out the achievements of the African race from the annals of history? Just how could this be done on such a universal scale? 3. How and under what circumstances did Africans, among the very first people to invent writing, lose this art almost completely? 4.
He's telling you the reasons why he's writing this book. That's why I thought it was important to start here, and we'll break this up. You know what I'm saying? But I want y'all to understand he's giving you the reasons, and I always thought it was amazing because it helped me clear a lot of thoughts of what we should be looking for.
Achievements of the African race from the annals of history. Just how could this be done on such a universal scale? 3. How and under what circumstances did Africans, among the very first people to invent writing, lose this art almost completely? 4. Is there a single African race? One African people? 5. If one race or one people, how do you explain the numerous languages, cultural varieties, and tribal groupings? 6. Since, as it seemed to me, there are far more disunity, self-hatred, and mutual antagonisms among blacks than any other people, is there a historical explanation for this? 7. And how, in puzzling contrast, is the undying love of blacks for their European and Asian conquerors and enslavers explained? These questions, along with those stated earlier, constituted the core problems for 16 years of study. And while the outcome did not eventuate in the more detailed work as planned, I think I succeeded in summarizing the most significant highlights of my findings in the chapters which follow this preview. Origin and steps in the study. 1. Review of world history, believing that the history of the race could not be understood if studied in isolation. I began a slow and deliberately unrushed review of European history, ancient and modern, and the history.
So, as I was reading this book, or going through this, right, I was realizing that he was showing us how to study. So he said he started with Europe. He took his time, old and new, to understand, because to understand what happened to us, we have to understand what happened in Europe as well.
History of the Arabs and Islam. I say review because by 1950 I had already studied and taught in the 3 fields of American, European, and Arabic history, a most fortunate circumstance for the task ahead. 2. Began the formal study of Africa and Europe, not Africa. I did not know how very wise this was when the decision was made, for I did not then know that Europe and Asia had been holding out of Africa over the centuries just about all of the historical materials I needed to see and study at the very outset.
So he said that when he went to Africa, when he said that when he realized that he had already studied world history and like all certain types of history, but not Africa, right? And he said, so when he went into his study, he made a choice to only study Europe and Asia, right? But he didn't realize at the time how important it was because all of the artifacts that used to be in Africa has been taken out of Africa, or what we call Africa, and it's in Europe and Asia today.
And which, of course, could not be found in Africa. Certainly, I knew from reading all about the rape of Africa, but to know the scale on which this was done, one must see at least some of it in Europe with his own eyes and be amazed. The museums in various cities of the European colonial powers are the repositories of much African history. 3. Documentary sources. These are available in both Europe and America. Reports of colonial administrators in Africa, parliamentary debates, reports and letters from geographers, explorers, captains of slave ships, and, especially rewarding, the reports and letters from missionaries to their respective societies' home offices. For the earliest records on ancient Africa and Europe, Greek and Roman sources were the most useful. 4. Field studies. The field studies covered 2 years of work in Africa. Armed with a rather solid background in written documentaries, the primary concern now turned to oral history and the developing methods of historical criticism applicable to it. Several chapters will be required just to detail the methods and procedures in this relatively new and rewarding field of oral tradition. Every region of Black Africa was covered. 26 nations in East, West, Central, and Southern Africa, and 105 language groups. Scope of the study.
So he just told you that there's 26. There's 26 of them. So a lot of people, as big as Africa is, he just told you 26 nations. So we could already break this study down if we wanted to study it in the groups of 13 and break it down. It would take you time, but this is the proper way to study, right? When we dealing with stuff. So you gotta kind of make your mind up and just kind of start where you feel will interest you at first and work your way through it. You know what I'm saying? I'm just pointing out that these are the proper ways to find information.
We began in the lands bordering the Mediterranean on the north and extending southward on both sides of the Nile below the 10th parallel, thus including Axum and neighboring kingdoms. This vast territory was the ancient Ethiopian Empire, a federation of autonomous and semi-autonomous kingdoms. The study began here, firstly because this was the heartland of the African race, where evidence of that first Black civilization is to be found there still, despite all the centuries of efforts to destroy it. From the researcher's viewpoint, the most important part of the investigation was the beginning of the task of singling out and clearly setting forth the precise nature of Africa's own independently developed civilization. A continent-wide study of the traditional customary laws of the blacks, for example, enabled us to learn for the first time that a single constitutional system prevailed throughout all Black Africa, just as though the whole race, regardless of the countless differences in language and other locally determined cultural patterns, lived under a single government.
So what he's telling you is as he dug and as he researched and as he dug and he went to like the heartland by the 10th parallel, the Ethiopian kingdom, he's saying that he realized that it was so much that they were hiding and so much like that. You got to understand. Now let me say this. They destroyed a lot of the evidence. Like even today they still finding stuff that's been buried under like piles of like a mountain of rocks. You know what I'm saying? Let me go back a little bit real quick, y'all. Not far. I want to show you something. Just to stay on that.
A continent-wide study of the traditional customary laws of the Black.
That's what it was. So he was saying that he recognized being there, that they had a constitution. See, when we grew up and we taught that our ancestors was running around butt naked, they ain't had no laws, they was like primitive. And then to find out that they had a constitution regardless of the tribe, the nation, or whatever they was a part of.
Acts, for example, enabled us to learn for the first time that a single constitutional system prevailed throughout all Black Africa, just as though the whole race, regardless of the countless differences in language and other locally determined cultural patterns, lived under a single government. A similar continent-wide study of African social and economic systems through the millenniums reveal the same overall pattern of unity and sameness of all fundamental institutions. That there is a historical and fundamental basis for real brotherhood and unity of the Black race could not have escaped the notice of all of those Europeans who have been investigating and writing.
When we see...
Give me a second, you know how these commercials be.
About Africa over the years. But they are shrewd. Massive Black unity would be massive Black power, which of course would reduce white power and its domination of the whole earth. So white Africanist writers always concentrate on the ethnic differences among Africans, tribal antagonism, hopeless language barriers, the cultural varieties, etc. They even make a separate ethnic group of their own mulatto offsprings from black women by classifying them as white in some areas and colors in others. Hence, a system of thought and practices were developed and superimposed on an already divided race to keep them permanently divided. No one can deny that in this too, the whites have been most successful. We have presented in chapter 6 enough.
Said they had a system. They had a system at the time where the mulatto kids was considered white, or they was considered colored in some system. So he's saying that there was some form of like racism.
For the traditional African Constitution and the fundamental rights of the African people to be specific beginning points for the identity and the discovery of the heritage we talk about with any definite frame of reference. Chapter 7 views the long drawn-out migrations as continent-wide movements that help to explain many of the most important factors in the destruction of black civilization. For the migrations help to answer the question, what happened to the African people, or what caused them to descend from the highest place to the lowest among the peoples of the world? Even though the work was radically abridged, an innovation in historical research was introduced by going beyond the mere documentation of sources in order to validate, beyond all questions of doubt, the principal viewpoints of the work. This was the case study method by which a representative number of states from every region of the continent was studied: North, East, West, Central, and Southern Africa. In the View from the Bridge and the final chapters, I make a more definite break from the old line school of historians to be objective and scientific. This school insists the research scholar should do no more than present the comprehensive and fully documented results of his investigations. There should be no subjective commentaries, no editorializing. Just present the factual data and leave the work to the readers to interpret or evaluate as they choose.
So he said he went against. So in school, they basically teach the people. They teach in America. They teach today. Is like when you find information, right? They're saying like in school and in this in how should I say the way that they make you present it? Because when I was at school, you got to present it where you find information and you present it, but you draw no lines. You know what I'm saying? You can't say, well, I seen this house over here in South America, and I seen them same building built the same way in Asia. So these people must have been over here. You know, they don't allow you to draw those lines, which is kind of crazy because a lot of this it has been proven to be true. But if they say that you just present the evidence to the people because they just want you to present this what you find and walk away and leave it to the reader. He said he goes away from that in this book because, for one, he's going to present the information, but he's also going to tell you from his understanding being a history major and graduating from college in America and in London and Europe, what he has put together. And I think it's very important that we do allow people to draw lines and then we look at it. We're supposed to investigate the whole thing. If we just get the facts, we might not be able to interpret it the way the person that's presenting it to us can.
This may not only be the correct viewpoint, but it is even beautiful for historians who represent the already arrived people who control the world. They can well afford the luxury of historical knowledge for knowledge's sake, the great satisfaction that comes from just knowing how things came to be. But the black historian, member of a race under perpetual siege and fighting an almost invisible war for survival, dare not follow in these footsteps of the master. Quite the contrary, after faithfully researching and piecing together the fragmented record of the race's history, the task of critical analysis and interpretation should begin. What were our strengths in the past? In what respects were we most vulnerable? Where did we go wrong? And all this, like the study of history itself, must be for the express purpose of determining what to do now.
He said the question, so just the way he thought, I thought was unique and genius. You know, these are the questions that we're supposed to be giving our kids. You know what I'm saying? Like, we're supposed to, people always say, man, what the fuck history got to do with now? We need to know our history to know we're going in our future to fix the problem. We need to know where were we good, like, what were we good at when we was in power? What were we admired about? What were we vulnerable? What was our weaknesses? Right? This is not the thought process that's going through the heads of the so-called kings and queens of the races of America, you know what I'm saying, that so-called want to rise out their oppression, but think they can do it without putting anything in their mind.
In short, the black historian, if he is to serve his generation, must not hesitate to declare what he thinks the results of his studies mean. For even when our history shows us where we have been weak, it is also showing us how, through our own efforts, we can become strong again. The white Arabs. The relentless searchlights of history were turned on the roles played by the use of both Islam and Christianity in the subjugation of the blacks. This confused many and outraged those who do not pause to distinguish evil men who use religion to disguise their real aims from religion itself. So the unthinking Muslim or Christian is likely to think that his religion is being attacked rather than the conquerors and enslavers who disgrace it in covering their drive for wealth.
So he made a very good point just now. On a historical level, that he noticed that the people that came to conquer, they came to conquer through Christianity and Islam, right? And he said, and regardless of that, the normal person who is following the religion, which really they've been conquered, when people start attacking the conqueror and the basis of what he brought, people are going to take it as he or she is attacking the religion, right? When it's crazy. Let's go back a little bit.
How, through our own efforts, we can become strong again. The white Arabs. The relentless searchlights of history were turned on the roles played by the use of both Islam and Christianity in the subjugation of the blacks. This confused many and outraged those who do not pause to distinguish evil men who use religion to disguise their real aims from religion itself. So the unthinking Muslim or Christian is likely to think that his religion is being attacked rather than the conquerors and enslavers who disgrace it in covering their drive for wealth and world domination. The blacks in the United States seem to be more mixed up and confused over the search for racial identity than anywhere else.
He said the blacks in America, right, are the most confused and the ones searching for their identity more than any other people, the black people that's all over the planet, whether South America, whether in Europe, whether in Asia, China, anywhere. The American blacks are the most destructed and distraught and that don't know their identity.
Hence, many are dropping their white Western slave masters' names and adopting not African, but their white Arab and Berber slave masters' names. For the Arabs themselves are a white people. The Semitic division.
We're unstoppable.
And remember, this is not religious talk. This guy, he only deal with historical facts.
And therefore, blood brothers of the Jews, against whom they are now arrayed for war. The confusion will continue, however, as long as the fact that millions of mulattoes in Arab countries are considered white is ignored, along with the other fact that countless unmixed, sun-baked, desert-dwelling Arabs are not only brown, but some are very dark in color. All this darkening of the skin, in spite of their ages-old tradition of the thick cloth covering the face from the scorching sun. Indeed, not only do mulattoes consider themselves 100% Arab, but jet black Africans. whose forebears were in Arabia for generations, speak Arabic and call themselves Arabs, just as black Americans speak English and call themselves Americans. In both cases, neither the black Arab nor black American thinks he is white. To repeat then, the blacks are in Arabia for precisely the same reasons blacks are in the United States, South America, and the Caribbean islands: capture and enslavement. In studying the actual records in the history of the race, therefore, the role of white Arabs must not be obscured either by their Islamic religion or by the presence of the Africans and Afro-Arabs among them, any more than we should permit white Europeans and white Americans to use Christianity to cover their drive for power and control over the lives of other peoples. The European Journey. I arrived in England in the fall of 1953 to begin formal studies at Oxford University, primarily through the Institute of Colonial Studies and at Rhodes House, which might be more properly called Africa House. In addition to the study of documentary sources on Africa, I had other objectives. One, I wanted a more direct, close-up view of the European mind, its real attitude toward the black world. Two, the extent to which European wealth and power were derived directly from Africa. Three, the nature and philosophy of the European education that was shaping and determining the mentality of Africans. For I was already fully aware of the disastrous effects of the white American education system on black Americans who, not having any other frame of reference, had to adopt the ideologies and viewpoints of the whites to survive at all, even when these viewpoints are against themselves. This meant visiting various classrooms in elementary and secondary schools, teacher training institutes, and classrooms of lecturers and professors in a selected number of colleges in the universities. Note: the term black was given a rebirth by the Black Youth Revolt. As reborn, it does not refer to the particular color of any particular person, but to the attitude of pride and devotion to the race whose homeland from times immemorial was called the land of the blacks.
So I be telling people already that, see, even he identifies in the 1960s, he said that this black shit was picked back up in the 1950s and 60s by the youth. He started calling himself black, but it has nothing to do with the identity of the people or the skin of the people.
Almost overnight, our youngsters made black co-equal with white in respectability and challenged the anti-black Negroes to decide on which side they stood. This was no problem for many who are light or even near white in complexion, for they themselves were among the first to proclaim with pride, "Call me black." Those who hate the term but hold the majority of leadership positions feel compelled to use it to protect their leadership roles. End of note. These were not look-in and leave visits, but all-day studies at the schools visited, remaining throughout the period in the classrooms and talking with students, teachers, and principals thereafter. In such a study, one learns very quickly that the textbooks and other works describing education do not tell the same story as the schools in action tell. 4. Finally, I wanted to know, and again from direct study, exactly what made Oxford probably the greatest university in the world. What are the specific elements of that greatness? Was great teaching?
Hey, bro, I know you probably tapped out, but he had said something, because I know you had walked up. He had said something. He was saying that the word black, for all the viewers who have missed it, that he said that in the book, he said that the word black was picked up by the kids of the 50s and 60s. And they picked it up to challenge the whites, right? But it did not have nothing to do with identifying the people that came from another place. You know what I'm saying? And he said in his book, that's why I say I know it's a book, but this one of the realest books ever written. He even mentioned, like, he from America, but listen, break it down because he's very well studied, taught in Europe. And it's a book that's not passed over, but he talks about everything that we should be past. We should have been past this subject in the 70s.
Teaching a factor? And if so, who are the great teachers? Nature or teaching? Or, in short, what made them great teachers?
Then he said, who are the great teachers? Nature or teachers? So remember, my convos and everybody be challenging me and everybody always get mad, like, the people that don't understand, and they try to say, yo, that's your opinion. No, I learned from nature. And like he just said, who's really the great teacher? Man, the teacher, or nature, the teacher?
From just the foregoing aims of the study, it must be obvious that I was still examining various aspects of the probable reasons why the whites became the masters of the globe. In both France and England, I found that the system of education fostered a new kind of aristocracy, an aristocracy of the educated. College graduates constituted the new upper classes. The son of a carpenter.
Yeah, I said, I said I was gonna go through it just in pieces, you know what I'm saying? Because it's a lot in this book that's fire, and he said earlier that he's gonna go against, they teach us to write the book and leave the facts there and not to give his opinion, but he gave his opinion as well from him being a history teacher in America before he went to London and Europe and studied in the schools the Moors built. He gonna talk about everything.
Or railroad conductor became estranged from his family and former friends upon receiving his university degree. A case in point was J.L., a young Englishman in my college at Oxford, Lincoln, and who was one of my close friends there. He refused to go home during any of the long vacation breaks because, to quote him, I can no longer associate with my family and old friends. Wouldn't know how to talk with them. We have nothing in common now, This British and European philosophy of education fitted in ideally with those Africans from the continent and elsewhere who, unlike J.L., came to Europe from the privileged class at home.
So you gotta think about it. So he's saying that the system that they had set up, like, if you was educated, like, for example, if I'm educated in America, or let's say where I'm at mentally, like where I be doing these shows, technically, if I was in Rome or Britain, you know what I'm saying, I wouldn't even talk to my family no more because I'm on a higher social class than them. My mind is on a higher level than them, so there's no need for me to associate with the peasants. You know what I'm saying? That's the system. You know what I'm saying?
Some of those studying in England became more British than the British, just as many from what was French West Africa became more French than the Frenchmen. The first tragedy to note about the effects of this class education on blacks is that it further reinforced colonialism's policy of perpetual disunity in Africa and elsewhere. The line dividing these black upper and middle classes from the black masses and their basic aspirations is more rigidly drawn. And this superior class mentality, becoming even more crystallized since independence, is an almost certain guarantee of future uprisings on a scale never seen. The second great tragedy is in the nature of what is called education. It is...
For all y'all tapping in, he said right before y'all came in, who is the real teacher? The teacher or nature? And so he's back at this point where he's at right now, where the point was, who's the real teacher?
It is an almost certain guarantee of future uprisings on a scale never seen. The second great tragedy is in the nature of what is called education. It is merely rote learning, the ability to memorize phrases, concepts, and other required data.
So it's not. Are you learning, or did they teach us? Cause see, I got partial photographic memory, so I can say that I was getting these A's because I could remember. It's like we're not really learning in public school or in schools. They're teaching us to memorize and to basically indoctrinate our brain with what they want us to know, right? Because we're not really learning. We just have to memorize stuff to pass tests.
Thinking is neither required nor expected. Critical analysis and evaluation of subject matter are not required, but the ability to absorb and recall is required. The brilliant scholar, then, is one who can readily quote authorities and remember well his bibliographical sources. So we have a generation of black scholars who continue to amaze students by mouthing the doctrines and viewpoints of their white teachers. Like so many robots without minds of their own. Yet,
so a lot of times when we be watching people talk, some of the people that we look up to, when they went to college, whether they had white or black teachers, if they learned in the institution of America or through the systems that set up through colonialism, which is after slavery on any continent, then all we did was we learned certain things, we memorized certain things, and then we regurgitated what them teachers taught us. Because as he was saying that in school we learn to memorize, but you do not have to think, because thinking means you're challenging thought and objecting to the things that's being taught.
Study under white teachers and professors should be most rewarding, and it can be if you do not enter white institutions with a head like an empty pitcher going to a fountain to be filled. I was safe and richly rewarded during my studies in white universities only because I happened not to be so naive that I expected the viewpoints of the conquerors to be the same as those of the conquered on matters relating to our place in the world. Elsewhere, I have emphasized by repetition that some of the most fruitful sources for study came quite unintentionally from white scholars.
So he was saying that most of the things that he learned that really, or most of the things that kind of helped him really learn true history or learn the truth, it came out the mouth of like the white teachers and scholars that he was in their classes.
Case in point was at Oxford.
If you want to sell online.
So he about to tell you, said case in point was when he was at Oxford College.
The course was the history of colonialism in Africa. The presence of 2 or 3 blacks in the class, while obviously uncomfortable to some, was generally ignored. For African studies were of long standing as an integral part of the imperial system. They were not planned for Africans at all, but for the future administrators of the empire in Africa. So Professor Madden was...
So think about this shit. So they wasn't teaching African studies for the Africans, because there was very few Africans or so-called black people in the class, right? The class was made for the next rulers, the younger generation who will rule Africa next, or these other places. But you have to have a history. See, this is what I mean when I say that we might argue about it, but every other nationality on the planet knows our history. Because in order to rule, you have to understand our history and understand all of this. But we do not get this same thing, and we don't have the same foundation.
Was pointing out in his lecture how difficult and even impossible it was to rule Africans in view of their wild and most primitive system of democracy. For just as fast as African kings or chiefs undertook to carry out British laws which displeased the people would remove them from office. Therefore, this primitive African democracy had to be destroyed before the British system of indirect rule could be effective.
So basically, he accidentally told him, he was saying Africans had a primitive system, saying that every time they went to the coast of the country, that it would be a new ruler. And he said that was primitive. Now, if you're the land that gets told what to do by a king or queen, freedom looks dumb. And if you're free and you go to a land where people being ruled by 1 or 2 people, that looks dumb. So in his arrogance, he accidentally told the black students that they did not have a democracy. I will correct them in this. That's what a republic is. And in America, we're supposed to live until the republic for which it stands, but we don't live in a republic. We live in a democracy. You see the game? So at the end of the day, the key to what he's saying is that he realized that, oh shit, we had a government. And so in order for them to rule Africa, they had to destroy the existing government.
The point here is that these sneering remarks by an eminent British historian revealed to me an entirely new field of research. That lecture led me into the study of one of the most significant developments in the entire history of the black race, an ancient system of democracy existing before Greece, evolved from a continent-wide constitution that governed the whole African people as a single race. This all-important finding was arrived at by comparative studies of African customary laws in every region of the continent. The Europeans were confronted with a real social democracy that existed long before the terms socialism and democracy were invented in the West. For Dr. Madden, it was savage because the people were the real rulers, in fact, and not merely in theory.
See, and that's how it's supposed to be in America. You know what I'm saying? The people it's supposed to be checks and balances where the people hold the politicians accountable and the politicians put pressure on the next level, but the people pick the electorate. We're supposed to be in that. Not just what, like he said, not just where it's supposed to look like it, like what we going through in America.
The field studies. Insofar as the study of African history is concerned, I regard direct investigation in the field and in Africa as of the highest importance. This field work should be undertaken only after thoroughgoing research in written and other documentary sources. The study of available written sources, their evaluation, and the mounting archaeological records are all the first major phase of African research, and I would say a prerequisite for fieldwork. The fieldwork was mainly concerned with oral history. I had noted in my study of sources of noted historians that many who decried oral tradition as unreliable never failed to use it themselves to supplement or give added validity to their works. The fact is that neither written nor unwritten records should be accepted as true without verification.
So regardless of the information you get, you should never oral tradition is more ancient than written down tradition. Before we was writing, we would pass down tradition. So we can't throw oral tradition out like, oh man, that's just old folk tale. Like, no, we can't throw it out. Just like we can't just because it's something that they got now, or something that we can see, or something that's written down, just because it's on a wall, on a pyramid, it doesn't make it true. It still has to be investigated and proven true.
Although 2 years were devoted to the fieldwork, the ground covered was possible only because of careful advanced planning and the scheduling of areas and groups in each country months ahead of my arrival. These had to be in the hinterland, or bush country, generally far away from the westernized urban centers. For our quest was not for the long-standing tradition of either Islam or Christianity in Africa, but for the more ancient tradition of Africa itself. So vast and untapped is the real history of the African race that I myself only scratched the surface of what is yet to be done. Some of the areas to be explored by future historians are set forth in pages which follow in this chapter. A major research project should not be undertaken by a single individual.
Let me tell you what he's saying, and I had to realize it. Throughout the book, he's gonna say side note. Like when he talk about the Moors, one of his side notes was side note. My people in America need to investigate their connection to the Moors and their estate. He said, I don't have enough time. I'm studying all of these things to write this book. I I can't dig for 5 to 10 years in this area. So he kind of planted the seeds for those who read this book for what areas need to be investigated more and brought forth, right? But it's a book that kind of got brushed under the covers.
This was my mistake. Hence, the 16 years of work that a research team of 8 or 10 persons might complete in 3 or 4. The kind of well-organized research teams required for in-depth studies may be difficult to promote because of our pitiful go-it-alone individualism. A research project such as mine should have had a team of highly trained experts from the fields of history, archaeology, anthropology, medicine, linguistics, tropical agriculture, political science, etc. The widely ranging scope of the study minus a team was possible only because of the interest and active support of certain African governments and the unforgettable help of the people in every region and country. For all kinds of help were needed. As indicated above, much had been prearranged. The United States Department of State had notified the American Embassy in each country that I was coming, requesting our ambassadors to give any required assistance. Excepting the Sudan, where embassy officials appeared to be under some kind of fear, the embassies everywhere went all out to be helpful. The embassies had the very important work of making the advance arrangements for trips into the interior through the appropriate ministries in each country. These in turn had to contact the various provincial governors or district commissioners who had to make living and conference arrangements with village chiefs, elders, the keepers of oral traditions, and other specified groups. The amount of time all this advanced work saved for the study itself is obvious. But volunteer work of our African brothers who accompanied me into the field was what I referred to above as unforgettable. Some of these were teachers who, as in the case of my previous field work, 1956 to 57, had secured leave for the purpose without any trouble at all. Indeed, even the people we call illiterate had that storehouse of wisdom which made it easy for them to understand that I was working not for myself, but for them, for the whole black race. I am trying to make it clear here that although I did not have the kind of research team referred to above, many people, 128 in number, participated in this work and made the outcome possible. So, when at various places I say we, it is not the editorial or royal we, but reference is made to individuals and groups that actually worked on various parts of the study. However, I had to decline the services of many highly recommended Africans because of their upper-class attitudes toward the common people.
He was also judging people off of their character and off their morals for the people that he wanted in the field with him.
I had learned quite early that the people in the interior can spot the arrogant and superior African just as easily as they recognize the arrogant and superior white investigator. They will give answers to questions readily enough, but not the right answers. I therefore selected only those whose heartbeats seemed to be tuned to the heartbeats of the great common people from whom all of us came.
Meaning that all great minds and all scholars can't do this mission, regardless of what we look like or who we are. And so meaning that at the end of the day, it's a lot of brilliant minds whose poor mind has been poisoned. And that poison is still sitting in their mind, and they can't see the truth because they already came there with a mindset that they kind of know, and so it's hard to teach those people. So he only took a certain few, meaning that he only wanted those who he said their heart were attuned, meaning that they were pure-hearted in study, meaning that they were open-minded, meaning that's the type of people I want to be around. Those who like, yo, it's not about me knowing it all. Yo, we gonna sit down together and we gonna dig and we gonna get the facts. But we gotta be able to deal with when we dig in that soil and whatever come out, that fruit, after we plant that seed and that fruit come up, we can't get mad at the fruit because it don't fit what we thought or what we believe. We gotta be able to look at this and really be logical about this and try to make this make sense and keep digging.
The interpreters were generally assistants who spoke 2 or 3 of the languages of the country. An entirely new kind of assistant was the verifying interpreter. This is to double-check the interpreters, for sometimes they do not convey your question precisely or give back the exact reply. There were training sessions before and during the field work. In those fortunate cases where we had 4 or 5 competent assistants, one of the interpreters remained with me, while the others worked on special assignments in different places in the area. The documentary research preceding all this in the United States was not done entirely alone. Some of the most important areas of my study of ancient sources were rechecked in independent studies by a select group of graduate students in history. Their assistance in reappraising such early sources as Manetho, Herodotus, Josephus, Strabo, Abu Saleh et al. Was invaluable. Foremost among these were Reverend Carlton J. Hayden and Mr. Donald W. Key Hefner. In concluding my remarks on the field studies in Africa, some comments on 4 of the countries visited.
Skill delivers incredible cordless power with advanced lithium battery technology for longer run times. Longer
commercials
are in order. In the Sudan, the authorities did not want me to work in or even visit the all-black southern provinces. Their 15 years of rebellion against the Arab North caused the whole vast area to be officially sensitive and therefore barred to outsiders. The suggestion was that I confine my studies to the northern Sudan. This I refused because I had been previously assured that the rebellion had been completely crushed and that peace and quiet prevailed everywhere. Besides, I could only find Islamic institutions in the north, institutions of which I already had full knowledge by years of special study and teaching. As indicated above, the American Embassy in Khartoum did none of the preparatory work about which I give the U.S. embassies throughout Africa so much praise, although it had 6 months' notice before my arrival, and they maintained a strictly hands-off policy after my arrival. I therefore prepared to leave at once, but announced that I do not beg to study anywhere, and that the world would learn that this was the only African state where an African scholar was barred. The Ministry of the Interior reacted swiftly. Not only was permission to do field work in the South quickly granted, but all the necessary arrangements were made with dispatch. This included establishing my southern headquarters at Malakal. The simple fact was that while they were quite familiar with European research people roaming freely all over the country, a black doing field studies in the Sudan is a phenomenon indeed. Ethiopia, the new name for Abyssinia, like the Republic of the Sudan, is also ruled by people of mixed blood who not only do not consider themselves African by race, but who maintain a privileged class society based upon color. To them, all black-skinned Africans are Bantu. To these, they feel superior by reason of white blood, and their discriminatory practices are just as subtle and real as those of the whites. And although the enslavement of black-skinned Africans continue in both countries, even in our times, both the Sudan and the new Ethiopia have adopted the Brotherhood Front since the sudden rise of so many independent African states. The Sudan to serve as the bridge between the Arab world and the new black states, and thus control or influence their international policies through the UN. And Ethiopia to more directly control or influence black Africa through Western backing in establishing the headquarters of the Organization of African Unity in Addis Ababa and pushing Haile Selassie into the key role of continent-wide leadership, thus blocking the, quote, dangerous influence